Welcome back to this latest episode of Japan's Top Business Interviews. I'm your host, Dr. Greg Story, the president of Dale Carnegie Training Tokyo, Japan. And my special guest today is an old friend of mine, Dieter Haberl, who is, well, he's been president of just about everything in Japan. So we'll have to hear about that story. So, Dieter, you have been here quite a long time. How many years in total?
25 in Japan.
25 years, right? That's quite a long time. So how is it that you came to Japan and what sort of things you've been doing here?
Long story, but originally from Austria, left Austria after high school, college in the US. I got there with ice hockey. That was in northern Michigan, Upper Peninsula. Graduate school on the opposite end in Arizona. It was an international management master's degree. And
this was at Thunderbird, right?
Thunderbird,
Yeah,
right. And Thunderbird has great regional specializations, and mine was Japan. So I had hoped at some point to come back to Japan. Was diverted quite significantly upon graduation to Germany. The wall had just come down. Coca-Cola hired me and a whole bunch of other bilingual folks to go there and help them with that. Fascinating experiences there, but that's for another time. Eventually, they decided to let us have a shot at Japan. Then that was roughly 7 years after working with Coke in Germany. And
so when you were working with Coke in Germany, what was the type of role you had there?
I came up through finance,
okay.
And it was what typically would be called FP&A initially. Kind of there was also a very heavy reporting function, managerial reporting. Quite a bit of work with East Germany, massive investment that the company made in that whole new territory. And ultimately then we built a massive new anchor bottler. We sold that 5-6 years later, and I was involved in the team that worked the M&A part of that, and that was a fascinating experience. That M&A experience then helped get me to Japan, where they needed some of that.
Okay, so that came up later. Just do me a favor, just come forward, just bring your chair a little bit more in this way.
Okay.
Yeah, so you're a little bit closer to the mic. You're just a little bit away from it. Yeah, that's good. That's good. Okay, so here we go. We'll keep going. So the M&A experience helped you to get to Japan.
Yes.
So you were sitting in Germany, United Germany. I mean, companies going bananas there. I'm sure the growth is tremendous.
Fascinating time. Yeah.
And yet you decided to not keep riding that wave, but to jump on a completely different wave and come to Japan, a country you hadn't been to before, or had been to before?
I had come here a couple of times as a student for internships and studying Japanese.
Okay.
So roughly 5-6 months each time.
Right.
So I had a bit of a background.
That back. Why did you choose an internship in Japan when you were studying?
Simplest way to put it is, I'm European, went to university and grad school in the US. I figured Asia is a logical complement, and of course, this was a time when Japan was number one, right?
That's right. It was booming in the 80s.
Yeah, it was, yeah.
Booming. Yeah.
So it was a logical choice, and ultimately, not directly, but after a bit of diversion, ended up here. And
so your role in Coke was in the same area, in the finance area?
Initially, yes. It was in Coca-Cola, very much in finance, a lot to do with what they call business development. So basically, mergers, acquisitions in two main areas. One was trying to consolidate bottlers into ultimately one large bottling entity, and
which is what they've done now.
They've
after
22 plus years
to do it. Right?
Yes, it's a long process, and that's Japan for you.
It's Japan, got a long-term plan here.
And then also on the vending side of the business, and there we were building a central vending company through some mergers and acquisitions, and then sold that back to the bottlers for them to actually run it. Same idea, centralized,
so when
professional.
You were doing finance in Germany, M&A, that type, very similar activity, and now you're in Japan, were you running a team in Germany, or were you one of the people in the team doing the work?
Yes, to both.
Doing both, right?
Yes.
So I just want to contrast your experience. When you came to Japan, again, were you running the finance team there, or were you one of the people in the team?
No, in Japan, I concentrated almost exclusively on those business development activities.
Okay, so not so much leading and managing.
Well, yes, but in a different way. The finance team they have their own regular routines. This was not that. This was specifically directed at essentially building future structures. And we had a business development team that reported to me, and there we worked with the bottlers and the vending side of the business.
So this is your first experience to lead Japanese team members, presumably, right? So I'm looking for the contrast. If you've had this experience previously in Europe, and you come to Japan, now you're on a Japanese team, what was striking to you that was challenging or different or unique?
One of the most readily apparent differences is basically in Germany, people will more than likely tell you straight to your face, that's a stupid idea. In Japan, they're much nicer about it, so much so that you might not even find out that's a stupid idea until it hits you in the face.
Right. Okay.
That's a bit extreme, of course, but that is a fairly good polarization of the experience. In other words, in Japan, you need to invest more in trying to understand the nuances of people in order to understand how to lead them and what they're not telling you versus what you're seeing and hearing. That may not be the full story.
And did you actually have experiences like that where, you know, you're full of vim and vigor, you've come from big M&A deals in Germany and here in Japan, you're going to shake the world around, and you start doing stuff, and then did you get to a sort of point where you started doing something, you realised, oh, this is not quite working as I thought, or people are not actually doing anything on this thing that I thought they'd be working on, those sort of realizations?
In a way, I had the luck of, in my team, having a very senior Japanese who was extremely knowledgeable of the bottling side of the business. And by knowledgeable, I also mean he had deep relationships there. So I very quickly learned that I could trust him, and also that I needed to learn a lot from him.
Okay.
And that was a key discovery, really, because you would sit in these meetings and you would think you understand a fair bit, and then you do the debrief afterwards, and the aha moments just keep pouring out. And there was a lot more, actually a lot less sometimes than you thought there was.
It's sort of under the surface was what was going on. And so how long were you at Coke?
7 years.
7 years, okay. So, and Coke didn't say, okay, Didi, we want you to come to the States and run some major operation there. You decided to leave Coke?
We had those conversations, but ultimately, I guess the simplest way to say is we decided we liked Japan more than we liked Coke. So we stayed, and we looked for different endeavors. I think it worked out well.
Say so.
We had some very interesting experiences along the way. So from Coke, it was Gap, and while I was at Gap Japan, that was a CFO role.
Gap Japan role, what was that?
CFO.
CFO,
yeah.
Right, okay.
And we brought in Banana Republic at the time, which was fascinating as well. So it was my first direct retail experience. And what turned out to be very helpful for my later career was the store development team reported to me as well, among other functions. So I learned a lot about opening stores and what you need to look at and what you need to avoid.
And how about the contrast between leading a team at Coke, which I'm guessing, you know, Coke in Japan's a very mature company, been in Japan since the 60s, basically, maybe even earlier than that. Earlier than that, right? Whereas Gap is relatively, at that point, would have been relatively newcomer. So the depth of the Japanese echelon of people's understanding of the business and the headquarters, marketing, branding, all that sort of stuff, probably wouldn't have been as deep as perhaps at Coke. So were there some challenges for you in leading a team of this sort of newer business?
You have to, and this is one thing I learned again and again along the way, you have to adjust to the new reality. And you're asking a very key question that's really insightful, because the nature of a company, even though all these companies typically have very good brand names, the nature is very different. So Coke is, it's a company that's over 130 years old. Gap itself was only founded in 1969. At that time in Japan, they just were going into their 10th year. So indeed, much younger company, and also a very different business. But what you find in companies like Coke, who've been around that long with that kind of success, that kind of staying power, typically the caliber of people that you encounter is very high level everywhere. In younger companies, that's a more mixed experience. So those are some of the challenges and opportunities you deal with.
And so how long were you at Gap?
Couple of years.
Couple of years.
Yes,
And then what comes next?
I basically got recruited away by Adidas, which had just acquired Reebok earlier that year, and that was a fascinating experience. I, at that point in time, didn't know how fascinating it was going to be because in Adidas they essentially had a COO role. So
COO.
Yeah, so kind of CFO plus. And at that time, major focus was implementing SAP, which they had tried before, it didn't go well, so fresh start at that. But then also digest the Reebok acquisition and look at how to make it successful. It turned out that Reebok was far less profitable than it seemed at the time of the acquisition. And
all that due diligence didn't quite get to the deal.
This might have been a good case of actually doing due diligence. There was a little too much reliance on the gentleman's handshake.
Oh, okay. Nice.
And I don't think I'm speaking out of school when saying not everybody was necessarily a gentleman in that situation. So Reebok had some very rough times, not just here, but in many, many countries. And here we found they were in every distribution channel, in every product category, and not succeeding anywhere. So I ended up doing a big restructuring. This was my first, I went from Adidas then to take over Reebok as president, and that was my first president's role. And it was,
this is almost like the poison chalice, isn't it? Oh, by the way, Dieter, Reebok's failing on all fronts. We're going to make you the president. Oh, great. Take me down. So when you came in, I mean, the people must have been demoralized. They must have felt like the poor cousin to Adidas, the major brand. They've lost out in the war here. They've been taken over. You turn up, this guy from Gap, which is not really a competitor, I suppose, with Reebok so much, but, it's not really even in that same vein, but sportswear as opposed to sort of streetwear. So how did you go about working with the group to get everyone together, assemble them, get them, believing we could do this, we can turn this around, get behind me, we're going to make this happen? What did you find that worked well to do that?
That's a very good question, and it's indeed those sentiments that you just described, the kind of the younger brother, the poor relation in a way, all those sentiments and more were there. So you have to do a number of things, actually. One, of course, is just simply find a new vision and the right strategy for the business, which in that situation is a challenge. But once you have that, then selling it into the team and making sure that, as you implied, that the team is motivated, that's the real work. Because even with the best strategy, if you don't have people believing it, nobody's going to execute for you. So looking at that and helping the team see that we're going down the right way, it comes down to one simple equation. That's how do you build trust? And we had just gone through a major restructuring. Letting go was roughly 25% of the people.
That's tricky. You got 75% of survivors wondering when their head is going to be the next one to roll, right?
Yes, yeah. And that, for me, was, ultimately, looking back at it, a great way to get into a president's role because, and not many people know this, but when I presented this restructuring plan to the board, the Adidas board, They basically said, yes, and by the way, can you do it for us? But no, in terms of restructuring, you're going to need to do 2 waves. One now and one a year from now. And at that moment, I swore to myself that second wave is never going to happen. Okay?
Well, so they're expecting having a second wave of cuts.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
And so you're staring at that, and you've had nothing but negative news in terms of the results for God knows how long. And
so the 25% who got cut, were they cut by your predecessor or by you?
Yes.
Sorry, which one?
By me.
By you. Oh, hi everyone. Oh, you lot, you're out. Well, that's tough.
We had a transition team, and that helped.
Okay.
So I kind of came in with all that.
Right.
But the key really was, how do you get the trust of the people that are left? Both in yourself, ultimately that's probably the most important one, and then in the strategy going forward. And I don't think this is different here from anywhere else, but it probably takes more repeated effort here, and it's simply talk a lot to people as a group, to people as individuals, to people as departments, but not just talk. You need to listen to, ultimately, no matter what leadership situation you find yourself in, you're very likely to know a lot less about the history of that organization than the folks who've been there much longer than you. So it pays to listen, it pays to learn, and then incorporate that into your vision of how to go forward. And I think when people see that, then they begin to build trust. And that helps a lot, because you're going to come again and again to points where people will say, is it really okay to take that risk? For us as a company or for us as a department. If you've built the trust before that, then that hurdle is much easier to clear.
I'm sitting there as an employee. I'm one of the 75% who's left, and you want to have a chat with me.
Yes.
I must be very nervous about that chat with you. I might be thinking, I'm going to get told I've got to go, or there's some problem coming up. So, even people who are doing well, I find in Japan, dread any sort of performance, review, because it makes them nervous. And I know myself, every time I do a performance review, I always start by saying, you're doing great, don't worry. We're just going to go through, it should calm them down, because you can see they're nervous about it. So they must have been very, very nervous. So how did you, you talk about you build a trust, but on their side, the skepticism must have been pretty high.
It was, and it doesn't go away with one or two conversations.
Exactly. Yeah.
What you mentioned about performance review, let me digress to that for a moment, because there's a lot that I learned along the way after that. But ultimately, a performance review, in my opinion, should never come as a surprise. So when that time comes to sit down, you essentially should have had all the necessary conversations. Because if you wait a whole year to tell somebody, hey, this isn't working, or why aren't you doing that, then you're just skirting your responsibility. So performance reviews need to be a constant conversation, effectively. But the approach that you outlined is the right one. You want to encourage people, you want to emphasize what they're doing right, and then point out, hey, try a little of this or a little less of that, as it were. But back to that initial phase, which was fascinating, because you kind of almost stumble through it. Because honestly, you don't know nearly as much as you think you do. So all you can do in those conversations is be honest. And looking back at it, in some cases, I was lucky in how honest I was. I remember a conversation with one of the key guys that I had, and he was one of these that was left. And I told him, look, honestly, I don't know if you're the right guy for the job. And that turned out to be exactly the right thing to say. And it wasn't by my design, it was just trying to be honest. But it turned out that he took that and turned that into motivation.
That's interesting.
This guy did, he was a major engine in that turnaround. He basically led his whole team to prove that, yes, he was the right guy and he could do this. So what I learned from that was fine-tune your honesty to the personality. Try and assess what kind of honesty will work with this person. And in his case, that worked beautifully.
Were there any cases where it didn't work, where people said, okay, I'm leaving?
Over the years, and there were a couple of people early on that did exactly that. And ultimately, my perspective on those things is, if it wasn't meant to be, it wasn't meant to be. You can't win everybody, and you shouldn't try. You should give a good effort if you think they can aid and help the organization. but don't lose a lot of sleep over it if the fit isn't there. Over the years, you go from that kind of dark period to needing to rebuild a team to looking at any given team and saying, you do a constant analysis. And that, I think, has been one of the ways to create success is even if you're a few years into the organization, you need to keep asking yourself, are we good enough? Do we have enough strength here? Do we have enough strength there? And assess every department, every leader, and focus on what do we need to do to improve. There's always something. But different teams, different people will move at different paces. So sometimes you need to help it a little more. Sometimes you need to just let it ride. That's the fun part.
So how long were you at running Reebok?
Reebok was 5 years. So 2 years at Adidas and then Reebok president 5 years.
5 years. So in that 5 years, how long did it take you to turn it around?
We did, and in retrospect, this is probably one of the key things. We built a very realistic conservative budget, having learned from mistakes that were made in the past of overpromising and under-delivering. We then over-delivered on that budget, and so after the first 12 months felt we had something to really build on, or I should say over the course of those first 12 months. Headquarters went through some similar things, and they were starting to come up with some really great products. So as we're well into year 2, we're starting to see some products for essentially year 2.5, 3, that looked really interesting. And we started kind of priming the business for that in year 2. In year 3, that turned out to be a massive success. Massive. And that was really the turnaround.
That's a
from
turnaround,
that point
changes
was
everyone's viewpoint.
enormous. Yeah.
But prior to that, one of the things that Japanese staff look to us as leaders from outside Japan is to manage headquarters, And that means manage people giving you the right products as you want them, or even designing them as you need them, getting supported with budget, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, all those sorts of things that go on. So how was it for you with, a loss-making business to get the support from headquarters to keep pouring money into this, to keep going? And how was that ability for you to manage headquarters helping you to build that trust that you talked about before with the team?
That is key, because ultimately your team looks to you as the country president, as the CEO, to manage that relationship. Because without successfully managing that relationship, you've got no hope in the business. You need exactly all that support, the marketing and everything else that you need to invest in the business. If you don't manage it well, if you don't build very strong relationships, you have no hope. So the key there is, and it's a little different. I've worked for American companies, I've worked for German, French, Italian companies. Headquarters relationships are different with every culture, with every company. Even among American companies, quite different. But ultimately, at the core of it, what you need to do is deliver what you promise. If you do that, then it gives you not just the right, but it gives you the credibility to ask for more. And you need to ask for more ultimately because they expect you to grow the business. You can't grow the business with less.
Yeah, exactly. So after 5 years, what comes next?
After 5 years at Reebok, Lacoste came next.
Lacoste, okay.
Kind of an interesting switch.
I think that's when I met you. I think I met you when you were running Lacoste, from my memory now.
Yep.
Which is how many years ago now? That's quite a while ago.
That would have been 2013 when I took over. We probably made late that year or early the next.
About 10 years ago. Okay. Yeah, and so Lacoste, again, very distinctive brand.
Yes.
Again, this time, though, you're coming to Lacoste with a lot of credibility. I was at Gap, big store opening, turned around Reebok. So that's a different game. Now you turn up with a lot more experience and also a lot more credibility. So did you find that was helpful to start running Lacoste and get people to follow you?
Yes, I'd say that with a little reservation because ultimately it didn't matter all that much.
Okay.
And that was mostly due to internal circumstances. They had gone through a very rough period in the 12 months leading up to that. The previous president had left. There was a vacancy for about 8 months. And a lot of management people and also to a degree in lower ranks had left. So there's a lot of turnover, a lot of instability, and some internal problems that caused that, and some historical issues. So the key there was simply to come in and, first of all, just stabilize, to fix things and make sure that people understood, okay, there's a calm pair of hands at the helm, we're going to get this under control, here's how we're going forward. The fact that quite a few people had left in the management team actually helped, because it allowed me to bring in a number of very strong people. And with those that were left, everybody gelled very quickly. We worked on that very specifically, but created a super strong leadership team. And everybody else saw how tight that team was. So departmental frictions virtually disappeared.
Oh, good.
And that's a direct result of how the leaders interacted with each other.
And what of that leadership team, what percentage would have been new compared to the original team?
That was well over 50%.
Okay, so quite a big chunk of new people coming in.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. And that makes a big difference, because that 50% plus are all loyal to you.
Yes.
Because you hired them,
Yeah.
And particularly in Japan, I think that concept of someone who's hired you as your boss, even in previous companies, staff still have that incredible loyalty.
Absolutely.
That person hired me into that company. They don't forget that. Maybe in the West we're a bit more, well, that's a company I work for and a person hired me, but I've had about 3 other companies since then and moved on, So it's a little bit different, isn't it, in terms of the psyche. So Lacoste was this the, I'm trying to think of that, was this the polo style shirt with the lifetime guarantee?
That's the one, yes.
I remember that, yes. And you, by the way, I remember you're a perfect male model for the polo shirt, as I remember when you were wearing it. You were very, very well built, fit out very nicely. So that was very unique. That was very unusual, to offer a lifetime guarantee on a clothing product, right? So was this coming from bottom up? Was this something that came out of your mind, or how did that originate?
I won't lay credit to it, because I won't lay claim to it. It was really a team discussion. The team from essentially day one, and we had a factory here, and that's central to this part of the conversation, a factory in Japan. From day one, the team told me, listen, the polo that we make here in Japan is better than not just all the competition, but better than the polo they make at headquarters. And you hear this and again and again and again. Ultimately, at some point, I said to them, okay, let's sit down and talk about this. It's all nice and good that we know this, that we believe this. And if you've gone to the factory, it really strengthens that belief. But, us knowing it doesn't really mean anything, because the consumer doesn't know it. And us just going out there and saying, hey, we make the best polo in the world. Well, lots of people have said things like that. That doesn't mean anybody's going to believe you. So let's talk about how do we actually put something convincing out there that shows people we do truly believe we make the best polo in the world. We kicked around a bunch of ideas, and ultimately the lifetime guarantee is the one that came up.
And have they continued that? Do you know?
They have continued it for a while. To be honest, I haven't gone back and looked in the last couple of years. I know they were running it for at least 3 years after I left.
Right. Because that type of commitment is a lifetime commitment,
Yes.
Maybe it's a lifetime commitment for up to a certain point when product was purchased, but it's still a lifetime commitment. So that's quite when you're thinking about making that sort of undertaking, that's a pretty big deal, isn't it?
It is a big commitment, and
what did headquarters think about that?
Well, you want to think this through very, very carefully. And of course, the first hurdle was headquarters. And the first time I presented the idea to headquarters is a flat no. Are you crazy? And I had pretty much expected that. Because it's a scary idea, right? It sounds like, oh my God.
We'll never sell
you're going to ruin us.
Again.
Well, so you take your lumps and you go back to the drawing board and you work the problem and you come back with more supporting ideas and facts. And one of those key facts was ultimately then also the key difference maker financially, because obviously we did get to implement it. So when we went back to headquarters and repositioned the idea, ultimately they said yes. Now then, and this is where we get to a very interesting part of leading in Japan, the Japanese organization balked.
Oh,
it was fascinating, and partially it's because of my leadership style. I'm inclusive. I don't dictate, because I think ultimately if you dictate, then you lose a lot of valuable knowledge that's out there. Well, if you're inclusive, that means you need to listen, right? You can't have it both ways.
Yeah.
So we had this great idea. We were really convinced, the management team here. But the organization as a whole, and that included very much the next level, was far from convinced. And this is when Japanese organizations can get really creative. In other words, the number of ideas and reasons they came up with why it couldn't work was endless. But you have to go through
Genius level creativity
Absolutely.
on why we shouldn't do
Absolutely.
this.
It was fascinating. So you deal with a bunch of them, you go back at it a couple of weeks later, and there's a whole new set. And you go through that a couple of months. But you wear them down, because ultimately you show you're listening, you're dealing with the concerns, you're addressing them, you're answering them, and on we go. You do that enough times, it builds, again, that core trust. In this case, not just in you, which already existed, but in the idea. And then they see other people coming with more potential objections and risks, and you deal with that. You deal with that very openly, and everybody sees, hey, this could actually work. And it did. It worked brilliantly, because what made us so convinced in the first place was the ridiculously low error rate we had on polos. On average, we were between 50 and 70 returned polos a year for faults. And this included really old polos, not just from last year's production, but old. That's against an annual volume of some 360,000. Tiny numbers, right? So you do the math and you look at, okay, let's say the lifetime guarantee was really no questions asked. So you spill red wine on your white polo, bring it in, we'll give you a new one. Well, by this time we had become a very data-driven organization. So we understood that every time people come to the shop, and these were loyal customers, because it was obviously a guarantee to members of the loyalty club. Loyal members come to the store, they are much more likely to purchase something than not. So you basically know that if somebody comes in, you give them a free polo, which has X cost, they buy another product. And that profit margin alone takes care of that conversation. So it's essentially just if you want to look at it crudely, you could look at it as a come to the store program.
A loss leader, as they say, right?
And not much loss, ultimately,
loss,
because that loyalty by then was so deep. We had focused a lot on CRM, and the customers really responded to that with loyalty.
If you want to be successful as a leader, do the Leadership Training for Managers course. All companies need people who can both manage and lead. Leading people screams out for real skills in communication, dealing with all different types of people, being excellent at innovation, planning, delegation, handling mistakes, doing performance reviews really well, and inspiring and motivating the team. Do the Leadership Training for Managers course now in either Japanese or English. Are you doing business with Japan? Do you really know how things work? Japan Business Mastery provides the answers. Do you have the right networks and know how to create them? Do you know how to get on the same wavelength with Japanese buyers? Do you know what being trustworthy looks like from the Japanese perspective? Japan Business Mastery is based on more than 30 years' experience in Japan and will become your go-to guide. Want to succeed in Japan? Buy Japan Business Mastery now. No, that point about the red wine on the white polo, my image is, if it was a Western audience of consumers, you'd probably get some person trying to pull one over the company, But my feeling is in Japan, Japanese person would be pretty hazgashi, pretty shamed to turn up demanding a new polo after they put red wine on their white polo. I mean, they know it's their fault. And I think that the culture in Japan, that honesty, also is a factor that people are not going to try and rip off the company for the sake of it. That's sort of, how far can I screw Lacoste is not in their mind,
Correct. We found exactly that. The basic honesty, that sense of responsibility that Japanese people have, really played very well into this. And it's fascinating. I would not recommend doing this program in necessarily every country, because as you alluded to, some countries people would take advantage of you.
Yeah, if it was Australia, we get a whole outfit of new polos every week. So how long were you at Lacoste?
4 years.
4 years, right? And then after that, where was it? Lapel?
After that was Toys R Us.
Toys R Us, of course, yes.
From Toys R Us to Furla.
And I remember when you told me that you're going to Toys R Us, because we'd done training for Toys R Us, and then we knew they went into some major difficulty financially at the sort of headquarter level. And I remember saying to you, wow, you're brave. But that was Japan, I think, was probably doing okay, but maybe the global organisation not doing so well. But what made you take on what is obviously an extremely difficult situation?
Yeah, first, the straight answer to your question is I like big challenges because I think they present big opportunities. And those big opportunities, if you do it right, you can get the team behind and you can make some really miraculous stuff happen. My assessment of Toys R Us at the time, remember, with my finance background, I had a fairly good idea of, what the problems were and that there would be a path. I could see a path to solution. Ultimately, they didn't quite manage to walk that path, and that had a lot to do with how it was managed or mismanaged by parts of the US organization. So the parent company goes bankrupt. Japan's still okay. Asia, by and large, is still okay. But of course, that shadow of bankruptcy hangs over you. And in Japan, that weighed on the company for a bit, because there's a lot of news coverage at the time. And
all of it negative.
All of it negative, constantly. And you follow all those numbers and you see how people react. And of course, many people simply thought, okay, they're gone, even in Japan.
Yeah, all the stores are closed down.
Yeah, so you need to make sure that people understand you're still here and you communicate regularly and constantly and make sure that people understand you're still there. And that worked reasonably well. The Japan business
the fan base was
enormous,
still there, right?
Enormous,
the fan base was still there, and the fan base is happy that you're still going.
Yes.
For them, America's America. This is Japan.
Exactly.
Stores still open. Still got great toys.
For Japanese consumers, that's really the key. As long as they, as you can show them that, hey, we're still here. This still works. That U.S. thing is the U.S. thing, but for you, we're still here. Business as usual.
What about the staff? Because, are you getting people thinking, well, the Titanic's just hit the iceberg. I better look for a lifeboat and get out of here. I mean, how did you deal with that?
The staff, and this goes for much of retail in Japan, and especially at Toys R Us, that was especially true. They are very loyal by and large. Okay? And if you communicate with them regularly, and by this I don't mean one-way communication, but really getting together with them, whether that's in large groups or lots of store visits, which I like to do, they again build that level of trust in you. And it's important because ultimately you need them to be there every day for the customers.
Yeah.
You can communicate as much as you want through your marketing department, but if it doesn't communicate in the store, through the store people, the message doesn't get through. So that was a really big plus. Great loyalty there on the retail team, and they put their hearts into it. They wanted this thing to succeed.
There's also, I guess, in Japan too, is that there's that element of shame. My company went bankrupt. I feel ashamed of my company. I feel I've let my family down, or I feel diminished. I mean, how did you go about re-establishing people's personal sense of motivation and self-worth?
Yeah, that's a very good point. That plays heavily into how Japanese see their job. It is something that they want to and they need to be proud of. So we tried to rebuild that, and obviously just making sure that everyone understood the finances of the company were really solid was one part. So you constantly communicate about the results and what that means for the bottom line, and that basically everything is safe ante. So we talked a lot, and I think one of the key moments was when we addressed in a couple of conversations with the entire team the bankruptcy in the US. And of course, you go through this, you do your speech, you have a couple of other key leaders do theirs, and then you ask, are there questions? And more often than not in Japanese organizations, you get a big silence, especially in a case like this, where of course it's an incredibly touchy subject, but you know that they're all anxious, and you know that it's impossible in any one-way communication to address all their fears. So there's still nothing coming. Nobody's asking a question. Nobody dares to step up. So I said to them, okay, here's what we're doing. You may not have any questions, but I'm not letting you leave until you are comfortable that you can go home to your wives and your families and explain to them why we're going to be okay. Then the questions started coming.
Okay.
That
was an interesting
then it
pivot.
was, yes.
Interesting pivot. Where did that thought come from? Because I can imagine, you've got a lot of people, because it's a very big organisation.
Yeah, 6,000
lots of people
people
in front of you,
yes.
right? And, questions. Crickets.
Exactly, crickets.
So your brain's going, that didn't work. Okay, you try to get some more questions. No questions. So it's interesting that you came up with that pivot. Where did that idea come from?
It's exactly what you alluded to a moment ago, that knowing that sense of shame, right? You need to avoid that at all costs. So we knew that they needed to walk out of there with confidence. They needed to walk out of there with, hey, we have a plan. This we can do, and here's why we can do it. So just because nobody's asking questions, they have lots. So all I did really was take that knowledge that there is this risk of that sense of shame. They're going to need to answer to their wives, their parents, their kids,
grandparents.
Yeah, all of them.
Yeah.
That's going to happen. So that's where that came from.
Interesting. So how long were you at Toys R Us?
That was just, 2017, a couple of years.
Couple of years, right?
Yes.
And then was it La Perla? Was it
Furla, yeah, from there to Furla.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
So that's, now we're in lingerie, right? We're in sort of...
No, sorry, that's, it's
sort of
handbags.
I'm
Yes.
thinking of the other one, sorry, I'm thinking of that. Yeah, my mistake, sorry. Correct me. So now we're at handbags, right?
Yes.
Okay, so again, a well-known brand, very favourite brand in Japan too, I'm sure.
Yes.
So again, interesting, you've come out of Toys R Us, which everyone has got a certain image about the company failing. And again, you coming from a failed company, how again do you establish that sense of, look, the company may have failed in America, but I haven't failed, and I've learned a lot from this experience, or however you wanted to package it up. How did you turn around that possible perception that, what is this guy? He's from a failed company. Well, how is he going to help us here? How did you go around getting around that sort of potential impression?
You're right. The risk is always there, and ultimately, in any leadership role, in that early phase, you need to find what ails the company and address those issues. In this particular case, I had done my homework. I usually visit a lot of stores and try to learn as much as possible before I join a company. Stores, if it's a retailer, of course. So I went in and I had lots of conversations with headquarters, and they shared a lot of the numbers with me. So I knew the company had grown very rapidly in the 4 of the 5 preceding years. But in that last year, they faltered very significantly. And then as I joined and had lots of conversations, I realized, hey, they don't have a clue of how to go forward. They just keep doing the same thing and hoping that something will change. It doesn't. So what you need to do is address the issues. And in this case, I noticed that the retail team in particular had really lost confidence. And ultimately, when you're in a retail business like that, that's deadly. So the first
particularly
thing,
such a competitive area
yes,
too.
exactly.
I mean, gee, how many suppliers are there of that sort of bags in Japan?
enormous number of competitors.
Luxury end, right?
And I guarantee you, and this is something we actually later used to our advantage, customers walk into stores and they get a sense of, this is very, it's not tangible, but it's on a certain level perceptible. They understand, is the company doing okay, or is there lots of pressure based on how the sales staff act. If the sales staff tend to go into pressure mode and sell, and only talk about discounts, etc., the customer feels pretty quickly, hey, not everything is all nice and clean. So what you need to do is give, in this case, I realized, okay, this retail team needs confidence. So rather than looking at solving the big problems, we turn to, let's just create a few small wins. And in some cases, that was just single store base, but then share that with the whole organization. So now they could see, okay, we have the ability to win. We have the ability to move in the right direction.
That's important, isn't it? Because when you sort of see the problem in macro,
it seems overwhelming.
It seems overwhelming, right? Like how are we going to lift this big boulder, type of thing? But you sort of chip a bit of a rock off a bit here and a bit of there. It gets lighter, you can move it. And so, I guess that excuse also of, it's hopeless. It's hopeless. It is hopeless.
Yes.
But that store is not hopeless. So, okay, there goes our excuse. So that creates a bit of internal pressure also, doesn't it?
It creates a different dynamic, exactly. And that's what you want to build. And once you have that dynamic, then you can move to the bigger pictures. Because then you get to a point where the team, again, has confidence in execution. With that confidence in execution, you can then give them bigger tasks. And those ultimately will lead to turning the business around. That worked really well for us, and especially during the pandemic then, that focus on the retail team, the work we did constantly with them, gave them the trust that the organization is taking care of them. And that translated directly into a very different atmosphere for customers. A much more open, welcoming, pleasant atmosphere.
Positive, upbeat.
Really positive vibes, especially compared to some of the competitors who were having a much tougher time financially. We did some of the right things financially very quickly. So we jumped on liquidity, we jumped on inventory. If you have those factors under control, you can ride it out and then take care of the team.
And how many years were you there?
2 years, 7 months.
Right. And so when did you leave there?
End of March.
End of March, right? Yes. So that's this year, right?
That's correct.
Right. So you're on sabbatical at the moment.
Gainfully unemployed. Gainfully unemployed.
Gainfully unemployed and enjoying it. Yeah. Well, you've had a pretty amazing run here with different companies. If we sort of think back, and we sort of, at macro level, and you've had so many experiences, but just sort of trying to boil it down to some of the sort of takeaways for people in our audience. What things have you found worked well in terms of getting teams engaged?
First thing you need to do is listen. You don't want to go in there and say, I have all the answers. So listen, learn, and then lead. For me, it's as simple as that. The teams get engaged when they recognize that you're paying attention to them. In other words, that they have valuable input to share. You work with that input. It doesn't mean you take it on board 100% blindly, but you work with it and You give it back to them and say, okay, here's what I hear, here's what I see, here's where we need to go. Let's talk. And you keep building on that. Doing that, I find people very willingly follow, because they develop that trust with you that, hey, we can do this, and we're being led in the right direction.
And a part of that, when you're engaged, you care about the organisation, so the innovation component can be stoked, right? And for a lot of companies, that innovation often, with multinational companies, the country head or senior people who are not Japanese, can often be the people driving the innovation, as opposed to getting the sort of bottom-up innovation. And so what have you found works well in terms of getting the team members to be innovative?
Innovation is essentially a question of willingness to take risk. And that, of course, Japanese people are taught to avoid risk.
Yes.
The entire system, their education and everything that happens to them as they get socialized into companies teaches them to avoid risk almost at all cost. So that presents a big hurdle to innovation, because by definition, to propose something new is risky. So to get people to be willing to do that, you need to create an environment where they know that, A, it's okay to make mistakes, and B, it's not the end of the world when you make a mistake. You learn from it. As an individual, as an organization, you build on it, you move forward.
Well, just on that point about mistakes, you know, I mean, we teach leadership here, and we have one part in the curriculum we talk about handling mistakes. And I've had Japanese team members tell me about, you know, their boss screaming at them in the office. One guy told me his boss threw an ashtray at his head because he made a mistake, and that thing about handling mistakes doesn't seem to be very well developed in many Japanese companies, you know. So how do you handle mistakes?
Ultimately, I look at it almost, you have to be almost a parent. A parent.
Okay.
Like the way you deal with mistakes is like, think of it as your child makes a mistake. Because ultimately there's only two reasons why they make mistakes. Well, three, but the two that you want to deal with, the third one I'll come to in a moment. Either they made a mistake because they didn't know better, or you put them in a situation where they were just in over their head. Okay. Third reason is, of course, they made it knowingly, but then you just need to get rid of them. Knowingly as in for malintent. But that's a separate set of questions.
And that happens here. Like, I was watching the news the other night, and in Saitama, this disgruntled worker started a fire in an outlet, and it turned into, like, I've never seen so many fire engines in one place at one time on the TV. But that's a classic, you know, like he was disgruntled, unhappy with how he was being treated, so he set a fire. It just took out the whole building. It was horrendous. So it's not like Japan's all peaches and cream here. You do have disgruntled workers, and this is a classic case. I mean, it's not very common, fortunately, but you do have that. So, But just that's abnormal. I think that's definitely extreme, right?
Yeah.
We're not going to have too many people setting the office on fire, hopefully. But like the parent is the way, okay?
Yeah, and this is, you know, when the time comes and you need innovation, you don't want to be in a situation where you say, okay, now let's be innovative. You need to have laid the groundwork, and that comes a lot with, on a daily basis, the way you deal with people making mistakes lays that groundwork. That gives them the confidence to say, hey, we can think outside the box. But it also requires that you keep helping them see, in order for us to grow as a business, to have success, we need to keep pushing the envelope. And that's just part of your regular conversations where you talk about where the company needs to go, what you need to do to get there, and then break it down and help each department see what they can do on the way there. So create the safety environment plus the need, the demand for innovation. And then ultimately, then you can have conversations about innovation. Ultimately, when you're lucky, it becomes a self-starter process where people actually come to you and say, hey, what about this? What about that? I find one way to accelerate that is to create a mixed team. If you have a purely Japanese team that you're taking over, it's probably not been very innovative. But if you inject, typically it used to be multilingual international folks, that can help. But recently also you get a lot of young Japanese that are, even though they haven't lived abroad, their mindset is very different. And they see far fewer hurdles, much readier to take risks. So shake up the team a bit from an age perspective, from a composition perspective.
Gender perspective too.
Definitely, yes.
Often the person who's possibly the most junior person in the echelon there is the person closest to the consumer too, and so someone my age bracket, if I was dealing with a very young generation-oriented product, what do I know about that, whereas someone who's maybe in their 20s would be right onto it. They'd understand the psychology. I noticed with my son, just things that appeal to him are quite different. And I feel old when I get that feeling. But anyway, that's another podcast. But talk a little bit about culture, because we've talked a fair bit about trust, so sort of covered that off. But what have you found works well to build a culture and an organisation that's effective?
What you want to have is essentially a really strong team spirit. And here I was lucky back at Reebok, even with all the troubles that they had gone through, what I inherited at the core was an incredibly strong team. So more than making that happen, I actually essentially inherited that and learned from it, learned to appreciate that value. But that team did everything for each other. And ultimately, they were put up against some really big tests and came through with flying colors and even stronger. So from a culture perspective, you want to create a team. And that means people don't see each other as, hey, the marketing department, the finance folks or the HR folks, but really see each other as people and partners in that effort to create success. It's easy to say that. You need to work on it regularly. You need to work on it with your leadership team. They first need to gel. And some of the programs you guys teach, some of the programs other folks bring to the table help a lot with that, because people get to know each other beyond just the professional competence. Ultimately, that makes a huge difference. So the habit of getting people out for drinks and dinner is actually a good one in Japan, ultimately, I believe.
Haven't been doing too much of that lately, though.
None of us have, and that's...
Yeah, which begs the question, what do you do when you can't get together so easily anymore,
Yeah, you try to compensate. You can do small things in the office, but even there, thanks to COVID, you needed to be careful. So you try and do some of it online. That's mixed results there. This doesn't quite have the same thing. But you basically break it down to smaller groups. And you take the show on the road. Go out to stores, have local, regional meetings, that sort of thing.
So if someone was being sent to Japan, okay, you go to Japan, you're going to run an operation, they don't know Japan, they don't speak Japanese. What would be some advice you'd give them?
Really that simple principle, listen. And that means also find the people that you can trust.
How do you find them?
That invariably will involve judgment. Okay? Presumably, if you're being put in a position like that, you've developed some judgment. So trust your instincts, ask questions, be straight, be honest, be very consistently yourself. Okay? Don't present a different face on a different day. If you can do that, you will figure out who are the folks that you can trust and who are the folks who are a little more reserved. Once you have that, then you get much better insight. But keep asking questions at every level. And this is important. Don't restrict yourself just to your direct report level. Make sure you get input from every level. Because the world looks very different from those positions. You need to see those.
Okay, what else? What other advice should you give them?
So listen, learn, and only then lead. Okay? The learning part is that ongoing dialogue where you take in the expertise, the experience from people that you need on a certain subject, and you give back to them what you make of it, and then it's still an adjustment process. And then you come to the leading part where, okay, now you've got people, you've had lots of back and forth, you've had them give input, they've bought into the process. Now you show them where you go with all of that, what you've made out of all of that. And then just be honest.
With that, though, you've got how much time to do this? Because, your organisation sent you to Japan with some expectations. You've got your sort of running sheet of things they expect to happen. And as you said, it takes a long time for things to work its way through the system here. So how do you deal with that? Listen, learn, take time before you lead, with the actual time pressure from headquarters to where's the numbers? Hey, look, Didi, you've been there 3 months, buddy. Where's the number? I haven't seen the number jump. What are you doing over there? How do you deal with that sort of pressure?
You need to create realistic expectations, and you may not have all the information on that very first day. But as you get the information, you need to have the conversation with headquarters. Here's what I think we can do and by when we can do it. And you'll be wrong. Sometimes you need to adjust, and you will then have to explain, okay, here's what I thought we could do. For these and these reasons, it takes longer. But be straight. Don't try to hide anything. You're going to make lots of discoveries. Be honest about those discoveries, share them, but filter them in such a way that you protect your organization. But if we make discoveries that are of a severe nature, take action. Your headquarters needs to see you take action based on your judgment, not based on theirs. And this is important, because if your headquarters tells you to take action and you do it because they told you, your team will know that.
And it's invariably not probably going to be the right action either.
Exactly.
What would some other advice you'd give them?
Build on the loyalty of people here. I think Japanese, whether it's as your team members or as your customers, can be incredibly loyal. That is a beautiful strength. Respect it, honor it, and you'll do really well.
Sounds good. So what would be your definition of leadership then?
Very simple. Do people want to follow you?
Sorry, say it again. Sorry.
It's a question. The answer to your question is a question. Do people want to follow you?
Do people want to follow you?
Yes.
Okay.
If you are confident that they do, then you're doing the right things about being a leader here.
What about, I forgot to ask you about Japanese language. So, you've been here, 25 years. You're leading Japanese teams, someone who's being sent here for maybe 3 to 5 years. Should they be learning Japanese probably here?
Yes, and even if it's just a little bit, it makes a huge difference. The difference is, and it goes directly, I think, to the heart of Japanese people. They love to show you a little something positive about Japan. It's that pride thing that we talked about earlier, and the inverse of that, the other side of the coin, is the shame thing. But being able to proudly share a little bit of Japan with somebody like that who's here for 3 to 5 years, that gets triggered when you show an interest. And you can show that interest with learning a little bit of Japanese, maybe develop a hobby. Anything that's somewhat cultural connects with Japan. Those things give you conversation material.
And did you do that? Did you develop a hobby here, or deal with the language in some way yourself?
Yeah, I had started to pick up the language while I was a student, and then worked quite a bit of it when I worked with the bottlers. None of them spoke any English, so I had to improve my Japanese. It's what I call functional, not fluent, but it works. And it makes a huge difference. You have conversations at a very different level. People find it much more easy to be honest with you.
Particularly outside of work too, isn't it?
Both outside of work and at work, yes. Yeah, you build very different connections that way. So, yes, It takes effort, but I would recommend putting in a few hours on the language.
Yeah, well, you must be up to how many languages do you speak now? It'd be quite a few.
Well, my native language is German. I learned English. Actually, my native language, my hometown dialect is it's a very strong dialect that's not that easy to understand for most German speakers. So after English, learned French, forgot all my French. It's pretty much very passive only now, and then Japanese.
Well, it's a lot anyway. It's very impressive. And Dieter, thank you very much.
It was a pleasure,
for
Greg.
joining us today.
Great conversation. Thank you. Great
thank you.
questions.
So let's all enjoy the next episode of Japan's top business interviews.